In June of this year, the New York Times yet again published an article on a question that's been plaguing secular culture the past few decades. The question is this: what is consent? The article, entitled "Yes, No, Maybe So, A Generation of Thinkers Grapple with the Notions of Consent," highlights the profound paradox that in a world where, and this is a quote from the article, sex is no longer morally problematic or unproblematic, it is merely wanted or unwanted. The article notes that consent has become the least bad standard. But almost immediately, the problems become obvious and also unending. What about times when you're manipulated or forced into sex, such as situations involving high-pressure job interviews, chronicled in the case of Harvey Weinstein? What about times when you perhaps wanted sex at first but later came to regret it? What especially about situations where sex is ambiguous? You didn't say no, but you didn't say yes. Sex just happened, and upon reflection, the sex was not enjoyable, and thus looking back, you really didn't consent at all. As the article entails, while consent may be the best we culturally have right now, we are increasingly wrestling with the inability of consent to guide us when it comes to sex. In fact, I would argue consent doesn't really give us all that much guidance at all. I am horrified when I read stories from the Me Too era that split hairs on whether the woman audibly said no to sex, as if power imbalances didn't pressure them into sex that they didn't want. Yet I am equally baffled as the culture attempts to judge who's in and who's out when it comes to claims of sexual assault, particularly in situations where there seemed to be some initial openness or consent. An audible no perhaps was or was not heard, and celebrities like Aziz Ansari are claiming that they were simply doing what they deemed appropriate in the moment that sex took place. I mean, how do we determine consent? In fact, I would go so far as to say, and the New York Times certainly doesn't follow me here, that the crisis we are facing right now culturally around sexual abuse is actually a crisis we created by transforming the standard of sex to simply being wanted or unwanted, rather than a deeper vision of covenanted, committed love that we find in the Song of Songs. Perhaps here is where I've lost you, and that's okay. Christians have done a lot of damage to their moral witness when it comes to sex. Clearly, purity culture, virginity pledges, and repeated sexual abuses by leading church figures has shattered any hope of our communities, of the church in America at least, somehow witnessing through our distinctiveness. We have done no better. But maybe, just maybe, that is precisely why we need the Song of Songs. There has been this refrain, a refrain repeated over and over that holds the songs together. I'm sure you've probably heard it before. It's always the woman speaking when she says, "I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine." On the surface, it sounds almost superficial, flowery, or weak. A romantic gesture at best, save for the pretenses of a soon-to-be married couple, all rosy-eyed and honeymooned before the true trials of life sets in. But when you meditate on this verse, it's a vision for love that actually runs far deeper. Two observations. The first is that this statement is a vision of mutual belonging, or perhaps even more radically, mutual covenanted ownership. In the Hebrew, the woman is quite literally saying, "I am the possession of my beloved, and my beloved, he is the possession of me." This kind of possessive language would perhaps have been used of a servant or a slave in ancient culture, and yet here, in a voluntary form of bonded commitment and love, the woman is so confident and so secure in the attachment that she shares with her beloved that she is willing to claim that he is in fact hers, even as she's willing to entrust herself entirely to being his. Now, I know what you must be thinking. Surely in the world of Nietzsche and Foucault that involve complex bids to power, this kind of vulnerability, this kind of mutual belonging and entrusted reciprocity, this is madness. You could be taken advantage of. You could be hurt or abused. Far better, you say, to stay as free as you possibly can. Far better to entrust ourselves to consent. That's the only way to respond to such a sentiment. And I get it. At times, I understand the madness of what this commitment is suggesting. The only way I can respond to this sentiment, which I myself at times share, is with this second observation. As biblical scholars have pondered the interesting wording here, most agree the clear reference point of this claim would be to the one God makes himself in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, where God says, "And I will be their God," possessive language, "and they will be my people." This is the very radical act of mutual belonging, mutual self-possession that God intends to make of his people. It is the covenant ethos of a God that commits God's self to God's people, even as they are called to commit themselves to God. Is it possible that we have misunderstood love because we continue to misunderstand God? Is it possible that rather than consent, it is actually a covenant we need, a bonded oath of mutual possession, the sense in which we give up ourselves to receive another self in return? When you start to talk like this, you begin wandering dangerously close to the gospel, where Christ gives himself up in order not just to be free, but to be possessed by us, so that we might be united and dwelt in by him. That this radical act that Christians have long called salvation is actually ultimately an act of mutually possessive, covenanted love, a love that declares, "I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine." Is it possible that love can go deeper than consent? Tune in to our newest episode as we unpack the belonging of love in a culture of consent in our study of the Song of Songs, Sex and the Search for Intimacy.